Let's get
Can
this
you hear?
going.
Can you hear me okay?
I hear you just fine.
Great.
Sorry,
Cool.
sorry about last week. I get busy with stuff, and then I actually went. I was over with my wife, and it was like, because she's at home, so she's like, well, when are we gonna do some special things this summer? And then I'm coming back. She's like, oh no, I had a 2:30. So
No problem. I know you're a busy guy, so things happen. No problem.
well, I briefly looked through the conversation that we did. We actually did it in July of 2020, so it was about a year ago.
Okay. Yep.
And
About a year.
and so I'll put that link below. But I mean, you sent me some things in the email. Where do you want to begin?
Oh gosh, yeah. I've got some nice light topics for you, as you can probably tell from my email. But
Yeah.
I think it would be good just to maybe first go over just kind of how the last year has gone for
Okay.
me, our conversation, and maybe just kind of put some things in perspective for you and some of the things I've been thinking and some of the things I've noticed kind of in
Okay.
my progression. And then
Yep.
maybe we go from there to more specific. That sound good?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so the last year, it's kind of been an interesting year to have a journey like this, given COVID and kind of given all of the isolation and disconnectedness from other people. So I feel like, having kind of a deconstruction or an experience like this is just amplified when you're kind of at home more, you're working from home. I feel like I just kind of even more so was just consuming YouTube content all the time. But it was it's been kind of a fun exercise, even just thinking about the past year since our last conversation, because I watched it a few days ago as well, and was just thinking, what things are the same, what things have changed in the past year. I think some things that I've noticed are different about myself. I think just more, I'm realizing more and more kind of going on this journey, how much more appreciation I have for kind of complexity and nuance when it comes to just faith conversations and faith dialogues. I've noticed that about myself for a while, but I think even more just this past year of just learning, from the Discord community to YouTube to different books I've been reading, there's just so many good perspectives out there and so many good insights, from many people who in the past I probably would have shut down, maybe in my upbringing. I know in my upbringing, and this is probably typical for a lot of Protestants, but in my upbringing, we had a very kind of derogatory view towards Catholics, for example. And now it's even just having some friends who are Catholics, and even this last year, I started following some Catholic thinkers on social media, started reading a couple of Catholic authors, and it just gave me such more of a deep appreciation. So one big change I think I've seen in myself in this last year is just kind of a deepening appreciation for the nuance and complexity for a lot of these issues. So I think in some ways that's a good thing. We'll kind of get to how that might be. There's kind of maybe a dark side to that as well. I think something else I've noticed too, just in myself, is the stickiness is a word I would use, but just the stickiness of the Christian faith inside of me. So I kind of asked myself this question because I've been going on this journey now for, I'll even say, a couple of years. What's kept me around? What's keeping me from letting go of faith completely, as you face these doubts, you face these struggles with the church, and like so many others who just say, yeah, it's too much, I'm just going to walk away. What's kept me still holding on, trying to find faith and belief in it? And I've realized just how, I think, deep faith is kind of just embedded into me as a person, and how persistent faith has been in me, even maybe during periods of time where it's like, if I try not to believe, you almost can't even help those Jesus, thoughts come back, or the Christian thoughts come back, and you're like, oh, I thought, you're kind of surprised at how sticky some of those things are, even with these new cynical thoughts where you just think those things would get blown out of the water. It's like, oh no, there's still something to these, to those experiences and to the meanings that were found. And so I think that's been, I guess, an encouragement to me to see that in some ways now I'm less afraid to have to face questions and doubts and challenges to my faith than probably ever before, because before going through this journey, I might have mentioned this in the previous talk, I don't know if I did, but I remember going to the library and even just checking out our Richard Dawkins book. I think it was God Delusion. I think that was a huge step for me, because up till that point, I was always pretty afraid of actually listening to what other people thought, what I considered smart people thought outside of my faith tradition. And there's kind of some of that evangelical, like, kind of, got to be weary of the world, and you got to be weary of influences of the world. So you need to be careful about what you're letting in. But it was kind of to a point of, I was afraid to read somebody like that, because I was like, well, what'll happen if I read them and I lose my faith? So there was a fear there. Then it was kind of a liberating moment actually checking out his book, because it kind of gave me permission to ask some of those questions and to kind of really, give myself permission to dig into the things I've been thinking for a while. I'm going to be kind of hiding from. So that kind of all goes to show, like all goes to say, now I'm much more open than ever before to entertaining ideas from people who think differently than from me. I'm less afraid to engage with those ideas. I think partially because I recognized kind of how, on one hand, the ferocity of maybe people who believe differently than you and some of the challenges, but also some of the robustness of faith, and that faith can actually stand up to some pretty strong critiques sometimes, and you can still make it through. So that's been another thing I've noticed kind of over the last year. So that's a little bit of an update. I've got a couple other thoughts too, just on some of the, maybe the dark side for some of the things I was just mentioning, but I guess, do you have any initial thoughts, or are these things that you've experienced too or seen in others?
Well, how did COVID impact either participation or non-participation in a church community?
A lot of things just moved online. So it was either, for a while it was virtual services. The church that I've been attending actually did move back to in-person services pretty quickly, quicker than some other bigger churches in my area did. But I would just say, just in general, COVID produced a lot of just an increased level of social isolation. And I think that just leads to more and more opportunities for reflection. If you're alone all the time, kind of in your apartment, or just doing things where you're not out and about being as social as you're used to, it's easier to become more introspective and to think more about these deeper questions. So I think on the one hand, it was good because it created maybe some space for me to think about things. On the other hand, it could be problematic because my kind of neurotic personality type can start to spin pretty quickly if you're caught in those kind of thinking cycles and worrying about things. So in some ways, it's kind of nice to actually have the distractions of in-person connection again, to just kind of get out of your head a little bit and kind of enter the real world.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Well, keep going.
Yep.
Keep going. You were doing well.
Okay. All right. So this kind of goes to my first point. So on the one hand, if you go through an experience like this, you're more aware than you were before of just the nuance and the complexity and some of the uncertainty involved in faith, where faith isn't quite as black and white or cut and dry as it was when you were raised, and you're kind of more aware of the uncertainty kind of involved in having a faith. And I think part of the struggle with that for me is kind of figuring out, like, now, how do you move forward kind of with that kind of new kind of sense of uncertainty inside of you. I always kind of describe it as sort of like opening up Pandora's box almost. It's like you kind of open up Pandora's box and all these things you had kind of buttoned up really nicely before you weren't thinking about, and now, you're just so much more aware of, all of the doubts you have. So it's, I like the rider and the elephant metaphor. So, the rider, I like to say my rider doubts, like the intellectual doubts, the things that are hard to understand. There's the elephant doubts that are like kind of more of emotional, of like, it's not even in my head. It's more just, I don't know if I feel that enough to really, want to pursue it, and then frustrations with the church. You open up this Pandora's box, and it's like, how do you move forward with faith again now with this kind of other element going on all the time? A piece of that being that, you know, to really live with conviction in the world, it implies it implies a commitment, implies a sacrifice. So to live as a Christian, it asks something from you. It's not just an intellectual assent to something. It's okay, now you're a Christian, now you go do these things. And many of those things require, a deep commitment and a deep sacrifice on your part. So it's, on the one hand, it was a lot easier for me to do when faith was simpler, because there wasn't really a question in my head of, oh, this could be wrong, or, oh, what if I'm not right about this? I think now there's more of kind of just a keen awareness of, oh, this isn't quite as simple as it was before. How can you live with conviction despite the awareness of uncertainty? So I think that's kind of where I'm getting stuck a little bit, because I find myself kind of wanting to move forward. I'm like, okay, I've been going through this journey, and I don't want to get stuck here. But it's like you've opened up this kind of new Pandora's box of cynicism and thinking about things in a different way. It's like, how can you start to make progress again despite all these other things going on? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
What does move forward look like to you?
I think moving forward would be, I think being more consistently rooted in something. Because I think I'm in kind of this gray space right now where it's just really easy to kind of flippantly flip back and forth. You're kind of living in intellectual land about faith. And it's like, I want something that is kind of grounded, is rooted, that is consistent. And that kind of that feeling, I don't know if it's a feeling I'm looking for, of just kind of conviction of like a certain, I don't know if it's a certainty or like a something inside that's like, okay, you're on the right path and you're doing the right thing. Does that make sense? I don't know if I worded that correctly.
Well,
okay.
It strikes me that so the video I posted today, I don't know if you'd have a chance to see that one yet.
No.
It's a young guy. He grew up mostly in Canada, has been living in New Zealand for a little while, might go back to Canada. Grew up in a very dysfunctional home. Got basically his life was dysfunctional, but he found, my take on it at least, is he found in church sort of a new, more functional, more stable family in a very evangelical church in Canada. And so for his teenage, adolescent years, that was very important for his formation. Now he, over time, I really like the story. I was hesitant about posting it because he's so young, he's 22, but he's old enough to decide. And he was really, adamant about me sharing it. So I went ahead with it. But one of the things that I pointed out to him, which some in the comment section didn't appreciate, we tend to, in our culture, at least certain individuals, think theory first and engaged, participatory, physical reality second. And I think COVID very much accentuated that, because of the isolation and the lockdown, we all sort of lived in our heads for a year and a half. And there was fairly little going to church, being with people, smelling them, rubbing up against them, talking to them face to face, smelling their breath, all of this physicality. And I I'm convinced that a lot of grounding happens in that physical space that we are not conscious of, yet it 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 communicates to us in much more subtle, um, implicit ways. And so, for example, I know for, let's say college counselors, it is not at all uncommon for someone to graduate college, to go to university for the first time, and now suddenly, not only is there no bedtime because they probably haven't had a bedtime for 5 or 6 years since junior high or something, but the rhythm of mom and dad of going to bed and waking up and going to work and having meals. If you have a household like that, that will produce sort of a stability from which people can usually think big thoughts, try new things. It's sort of that basic stability that, even if they don't recognize it or are not conscious of it, that affords sort of a grounding that allows people to begin to do things like ask challenging questions of their faith, or entertain challenging questions without high levels of anxiety, or, as you mentioned, go to, actually read a book by Richard Dawkins, The Faith Delusion, and open it up, maybe stuff it in a Christianity Today so nobody sees it, but um and and that foundation of things that we pay no attention to because they are so much the rhythm of our lives actually produces a freedom, a mental freedom by which we can let some of our ideas die rather than having so much else staked. I think about Tony Campolo's Tony Campolo and Bart Campolo wrote a book because Bart deconstructed. And there's a video out there of those two talking. And it's a tremendous video because at one point, of course, Tony Campolo sort of leans into his son. Now, a father can do this to a son because, again, they've got a deep well of relationship with each other. And so there's a lot of ballast. And if it's been a healthy relationship and a secure family and, good rooting, then suddenly you have levels of freedom with each other that you don't have when you don't have that basis. For example, a marriage in which two people feel secure and loved, and there's no, there's very little anxiety. People can have higher levels of intimacy in such a relationship because there's so much stability. And so part of what I think has happened with a lot of deconstructions is that, well, something has happened in the foundation, and it might not have anything to do with science and religion, all of these. And so in my video that I had with that young man, I called them yard dogs, where they are sort of like these dogs running around. And when I was going to put pictures of my kids and my Rottweilers on the picture, but my kids don't always appreciate if I use them as illustrations for things. So, but I had these when my kids were little. I had these two Rottweilers, and part of the thinking about kids and dogs is have big dogs when your kids are little. Make sure they're dogs you trust, probably got as puppies and, kind of grew up with the kids. So the kids are part of their pack. So the dogs are very protective of the kids and won't turn on the kids. So I had Rottweilers when my kids were little, and those Rottweilers would knock those kids over all the time, because those Rottweilers were big, heavy dogs. And when the Rottweilers would play, the kids would kind of back up because they knew if they were close, the kid's going to go flying. And every now and then I'd have to, my dogs would get out and they'd be like, I'm a happy day, I'm free. And I remember one instance I had my male Rottweiler, I had to actually physically tackle in the street because he was decided he was going to go out and have a good time. And it was like, the neighborhoods freak out when there's a 115-pound Rottweiler gambling about, even though they have no idea he would never hurt them because he's a very friendly dog. And so I basically tackled him in the street, and I'm over 200 pounds. And, these dogs were just so solid. I just tackle him and he kind of looks up at me like, what's going on? I mean, he had no problem with that. These are but then later on, when my kids were big, I had a little dog, and that little dog is like, that was a rescue dog and all these. Anyway, so much of, I think, what people are feeling is, as churches and church culture become increasingly less stable, as information about sort of the low level corruption that is
Yep.
usually implicit in a lot of organizations, as this stuff all sort of comes to the surface, this is causing for a lot of people a deep insecurity. And there's a different kind of exploration you do when everything is very secure and you're just kind of playing with ideas, or everything is insecure and you're looking for a new home. Those are two
Mm.
very different realities. But I think in the realm of this deconstruction world, we've sort of got both kinds and they're mingled together. And so we've got some people who have been, their base has been eroded by all sorts of things, and they are unhappy wanderers looking for new homes. And we've got other people for whom there is a deep faith built into them that is probably not going to be shaken by much. They might, that rider on the elephant might fully deconstruct, but if you watch that person underneath, you look at them and like, they might not go to church, but dang it, they sure are Christians. They've got all of this stuff has been built into them. And even if they no longer identify as Christians, and there might be one or two new additions in their life that they probably wouldn't have done while they were Christians, for the most part, they are just Christians with a rider making different noises on the top. And I think for a lot of people, if there's that security underneath, they can entertain a lot of their ideas, and it won't impact them emotionally. Because now the following generation that doesn't have that, that'll be a totally different story. But and so when I listen to you, I kind of wonder, well, where are you on that spectrum? Because it isn't black and white. It's probably more of a spectrum. And when I listen to you
Yep.
talk, I think sounds like there's a lot of faith down below. And you've kind of got the freedom now to say, hey, what about this?
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's funny because as you were saying that, I'm like, yeah, I could see a lot of myself in that, because on the one hand, I'm having all these existential questions, and I'm saying, and the writer's saying, I don't know if I believe any of this anymore, and it's saying things like that. But if people would watch my life, it's like, well, you might act a little differently than you did before, but you're still going to church, you're still reading, my bookshelf is still covered with Christian, thinkers, and I'm always reading these books and these ideas. And it's like, on the one hand, it's like I just can't get away from that stuff. There's something about it that even when the writer's kind of doing its own separate thing, the elephant is still kind of hanging on in many ways. Which is interesting, but I can also see a different, I don't know if this is exactly what you're talking about, but I'll say what I think I mean. So I think one difference between you and me is, so I think you've said with the Big Five personality test, you're high in openness, but low in neuroticism.
Yeah.
So I would consider myself, and I actually took the test, I wouldn't consider it, this is what I got. I'm high in openness, but also high in neuroticism. So I have a very curious personality. If I'm reading something in the Bible that comes across, and I'm like, and this just happened actually in a group the other day, we were reading something, I think we were reading the 10 Commandments, and we were reading the 10 Commandments, we're talking about, thou shalt not covet. And I think that was the one, or I forgot which commandment it was, but there was a little kind of, at the bottom of the commandment, God said, okay, and if you do this, I will curse you to the third and fourth generation. So immediately my mind goes and says, well, what is this cursing for the next generation? And is that fair to do that? And it's like, there's this high in openness that it's like, if I see something that's off or that's curious or that's even doubtful, it's like, I have to chase it. I can't just let it go. I'm always wanting to explore and dig in. But the high neuroticism thing is I'm very aware of in general, I feel things very deeply. So, for some people, if they're maybe playing around with these God ideas and they're thinking to themselves, oh, we're just kind of playing with these ideas. It's fun, kind of, the back and forth and the tribal games and playing with these ideas. I have a very deep awareness, I think, of the actual impacts on those ideas in my life, because we're not just playing around with ideas kind of out there. It's like these ideas have very concrete, real impacts on me. So while picking up God Delusion by Richard Dawkins on one hand was liberating, it's also terrifying because it's saying what would happen if I went down that path. If I read this and was convinced that God doesn't exist, and thinking about all of the impacts on my family and my relationships and the structure of my life and the sunk cost and Christianity and all the things I've done, and now saying I don't believe it anymore. So on the one hand, I think you're right, where if you watch my life from the outside, you say, yeah, there's still a lot of faith in him. He's not quite as skeptical as he's maybe saying he is. On the other hand, I don't know if it's the elephant, but there is this part of me that when I'm exploring these ideas feels very deeply about the impacts of those ideas, which is why I'm jealous of people like you who it seems like you can entertain those things. And it's just it's almost kind of like, I won't say it's a game, but I don't think it impacts you maybe as deeply emotionally when you're playing with those ideas, maybe as someone with my personality type.
I think you have a great point there. I think you're probably right, because my understanding of high in neuroticism is it's high in negative emotion. I'm very low in neuroticism. My wife wishes I were a lot higher because she's like, you never feel guilty. No, not much. And I'm very low in negative emotion. I just am. And I think that's a great point. So I think you're probably right in that. If you're higher in negative emotion and you're high in openness, that's going to be tricky, because
Yeah.
your openness is going to look for new things, and you're going to experience a lot of those new things. You're going to experience some negativity and negative emotion with a lot of those new things. So that makes real sense to me. I think that's really helpful.
Yep, exactly. So that's been something I've kind of had to navigate, I think, a little bit too, which is just, and I think I'm getting better at this, but even just for my own emotional health. And I was talking with Cassidy about this. We had a great one-on-one conversation, and kind of realizing at some point.
Is it on her channel? Did she post it?
It is.
Oh, good. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah,
I'll put a link to it.
It's actually a great conversation. But yeah, for people with kind of my personality type, it's addicting trying to learn more, and you see the YouTube video pop up where Sam Harris has another critique of belief in God, and like you see that thing and you want to click on it and you want to listen and you want to evaluate, but at some point you have to learn to almost cut yourself off, because the amount of negative emotion you'll feel, or the anxiety and stress of now having to deal with this new kind of challenge, it's hard for me to find that balance where it's like, it is good to be open and to be receptive to new ideas and challenging critiques. But at the same time, there's a near infinite number of critiques, and criticisms and different viewpoints on your belief, and people who would say you're wrong. So it's like, with a neurotic personality like mine, it's figuring out where you kind of draw the line and say, okay, like I'm done with this for today. I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to go cook a meal for myself, or do something that kind of gets you out of your head a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's been a challenge I've had to navigate too. I don't know if you've heard from others who think that same way too, but
it makes perfect sense. And
yeah,
we are now we're living in this world now where there's just a combinatorial explosion of access to ideas like there hasn't ever been for individuals in the history of the world. And that is going to impact different people on these personality spectrums in different ways. And so if it was 500 years ago and you were living in some little village someplace deeply embedded within a Christian worldview, you'd still have some of these same dynamics of high in openness and high in neuroticism, but the range of ideas that you would be presented with, you might find that less satisfying being high in openness, but you would not have just a continual possibility of endless things for you to feel negative about, constantly bombarding you by these corporations that are enormously powerful around us. So in some ways, well, thank you, internet. You've just given me, you know, how many things to trigger my negative emotion. Now I have this to worry about.
Right. Yep. Yep. Completely. And I think even as I try to relate to, my parents, even just in this conversation. So I'm very close with my parents. Um, and even the difference from my generation to their generation, the kinds of questions that I'm asking or the things that I'm thinking about, for them, it's almost kind of like we've never even had to think about that before. Not that they're not smart enough to have to think through it, but just that the amount of information that has being thrown at us is just unparalleled. And there are things that generation, frankly, just like when they were being raised in faith, didn't really have to think about as much. Right. So yeah, I could definitely see even just even just one generation in the past, how much it's changed.
And where you are in life. So I'm in my 50s, and like I tell people sometimes, the cake is baked. I mean, brain plasticity, that left a long time ago. I wish I was a little younger when I learned Spanish, because it probably would have helped. But I'm not thinking around. Maybe I'll be Buddhist now. It's just it's not there. It's not going to happen. And
yep.
It's like people are like, well, when are you going to become Orthodox? It's like, oh, I don't know, probably never. I've got my own personality aspects involved in changing religious traditions. Oh gosh, that even thinking about that work, fatigues me. You think I'm actually going to go out and start church shopping amongst Orthodox churches? And, not right now, I'll tell you that much. So there's lots of layers in this thing.
Yeah. You hear the phrase quarter life crisis. You've maybe heard that phrase before,
no, I haven't.
Okay. It's kind of like a midlife crisis, but somebody who's in their mid-20s, quarter life, who's kind of being hit with all these big questions of life. So it's, your 20s, what am I going to do for a career? Where am I going to live? Who am I going to marry? Where are my values and my morals? Where are those going to come from? Religious questions. It's really a hard time of life in that sense, because you're out of college now. You're kind of in the real world for a few years, and now you're trying to figure all of these things out. And it is different because in a sense, it's like you're young enough that you can still make a big change in some ways and actually kind of meaningfully live in that separate story. So it's like, for me, one thing I'm always thinking about is career, and thinking about, what I do now and what I consider doing something else. And it's like, when you're in your 20s, you have a lot of flexibility to still change. I could go to grad school if I wanted. I could switch careers pretty easily if I wanted to. Versus, like you said, if you're in your 50s, a lot less people are probably thinking about career change, because, like you're saying, well, we're on our way out.
They're thinking about being done with career.
Right. So, and same thing with religion and marriage, and it's even the religion and the marriage thing is very tied together, because it's, your beliefs, at least the way I was raised, is that, your religious beliefs will greatly impact the kinds of people that you consider dating or maybe eventually marrying. So there's kind of this weight to, well, I gotta arrive at the right religious belief, because what if I arrive at the wrong belief and then I marry somebody and then I change later? And so there's kind of almost this pressure too of, I've got to get all of these questions answered so that I can get everything lined up because of the stage of life that I'm in, where maybe somebody like you, kind of later in life, you're looking at it from such a different vantage point in many ways.
My wife always thinks, if something were to happen to her, I'd, be out there on the market looking for a new wife. And I'm like, I wouldn't even, again, I'm part of me is I'm a rut person. Once I start doing something and I like it, I stick with it. And it's like, when I go shopping for a new wife, oh gosh, that just sounds horrible. I had an uncle who, when his wife died, people were like, well, you're going to get married again? He said, I'd rather be lonely than miserable. And he didn't have a bad marriage at all. He was just like, he'd been around and he knows that a marriage is a big complex thing. And I've seen people with wonderful second marriages and wonderful later in life marriages. My mother-in-law had one, but they're enormously complex things. And so, yeah, no, you're exactly right. You get to a later point in life and it's like, move, remarry, change careers, change religions. Boy, I don't know about that. I mean, I just don't have that much potential left in me.
Right. Yeah. Funny comment, actually, just a little funny story about the marriage thing. So I was in a work meeting the other day and we were playing like a would you rather. I don't know if you've heard of that game, but it's just, you get two options and then everybody kind of has to pick, okay, like, would you rather do A thing or B thing if you're faced with this option? And one of the questions that I asked was, everyone was married except for me. And the question was, would you rather, if you could go back and redo it, everything, would you rather live your life single or be in an arranged marriage? And every single person said live life single. Not even a question. And
really?
it was really interesting. And it was everyone kind of laughed, and they were saying, well, we're married, so so they were kind of saying, marriage is hard and all this stuff. So it was definitely, it was kind of a funny moment, but it was funny. I was like, oh, maybe somebody will debate it. And I was like, nope, we're doing the single thing.
Like, oh, wow.
So kind of funny, but if you don't mind, so going back to what we were saying before, so here's an interesting, I think, analogy that might help us. So you've read C.S. Lewis, like a lot of his essays and things like that, correct?
Yeah.
Outside of his apologetic works and things. Okay. So have you read the one about, it's called On Riding a Bicycle, or On Bicycles, or something like that?
I probably did, but it was probably a few years ago. So refresh my memory.
Okay. So he kind of creates this picture of people, and people kind of go through these 4 life stages. So, and he uses, his relationship to riding a bicycle, like, to explain these 4 stages. So there's unenchanted, enchanted, disenchanted, and then reenchanted. It's those 4 things. I don't know if this is maybe ringing a bell to you, but the unenchanted stage is kind of like that stage of life before he ever really knew what a bicycle was, before he kind of like understood like its value and its purpose, and bicycles didn't really mean anything to him. Then there was kind of this enchanted stage, which is where he first learned to ride a bicycle, and he describes it like his life opened up to him. Now he felt like he had found the secret to life, is the wording that he uses, and that
bicycles,
kind of infatuated, with that childhood infatuation of riding your bike fast and going to a friend's house and having mobility and independence for the first time. And there's this infatuation, enchantment phase with it. Then he describes the disenchanted phase, which is kind of that stage of life, or the stage of, in terms of the bicycle analogy, is, riding a bicycle just kind of became work at some point. Like, he used the bicycle to he talked about ride to school and back. So it was, for him, it kind of lost its charm and its infatuation, and it would kind of just became kind of this kind of dull, kind of mundane thing. And then he describes now, kind of later in life, now he's re-enchanted with bicycles, and in the sense of, now there's this kind of newfound, deeper kind of connection and magic he feels about riding a bike, that even though it's different than that initial kind of infatuation, it's this kind of new, deeper connection. And he draws the connection in the essay too to marriage, so, and kind of his relationship to women. So at a young age, he's enchanted. Women are just kind of other people. There's not that kind of sense of attraction yet. Then there's that enchantment where you're in the honeymoon, you fall in love. There's the disenchantment, which is kind of the honeymoon wears off and you start to see them a little bit differently now that you've been together, and some of the novelty wears off. And then the reenchantment, which not all marriages get to, I guess, but it's that kind of deeper love, or that deeper connection that you have now, having gone through the cynicism and whatever it is, that kind of dark period, and now you kind of come out the other side. So I think it's a really good essay, and he says that applies to almost anything in life. And he kind of gives all these other examples too of how we see these stages kind of working out in people's lives. And I can't help it. I kind of see myself in that kind of framework as pertains to my faith, because I think there's kind of that infatuation period where it's like faith is simple, and you haven't really experienced a lot of doubts or like a lot of kind of hardships in relation to your faith, and you're just kind of enchanted with the idea of faith. And maybe you have these ideas that everything will go great if you're a Christian, and nothing really bad can happen to you, and maybe just these kind of simplistic ideas you maybe have at the beginning of a faith journey. And then there's the disenchantment, which is you start to experience things that initial mirage kind of starts to fade away, because you're like, oh, this faith thing is actually quite a bit harder than I initially thought, and maybe it's more complicated. Maybe there's some things happen in your life that were really hard and you would have never expected to have happened, based on kind of your initial expectation of what it would be like. But then there's kind of getting to that reenchantment phase, which is like you see with a sober mind the complexities of faith, the nuances, the hardness of it, and all of the things that make it hard and challenging. But there's still something in it that makes it worthwhile. There's still something that, despite the hardness, there's almost kind of a deeper affection and a deeper connection you now have with it. I would almost kind of say I'm in that disenchantment phase, I think, trying to get to that reenchantment phase, because I'm realizing, well, I'm probably not going to view faith the same way that I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because I've been through different experiences, things have changed, and I'm finding myself, okay, how can I get into that reenchantment? And maybe it's not something that you willingly will yourself into. Maybe it's just something that kind of has to happen to you. But I very much see myself in that progression, and relates to my faith life. So I don't know if that helps you maybe see kind of where I'm at, and how can I get past the disenchantment, cynicism, and kind of that stage into a stage that sees it sees it with a sober mind, and so with a sober vision, but can get past the cynicism into a point of a deeper kind of appreciation and connection.
I think that sounds good and right. And I think part of modernity is this sort of low level colonization in us that we imagine faith is a project that we undertake and we are solely responsible for it. Now, speaking as a Calvinist, I would suggest that part of that perspective is, in fact, sort of an Arminian bias that says faith is something I do. And I'm not going to, I find few Calvinists that actually undermine personal responsibility. We are responsible for whole ranges of things. But again and again and again, if you read in the Bible, faith is a gift. And I think you're right in that reenchantment, it's not wholly up to you. Now, you can ask God for it, but gifts are given or not given. And that powerlessness, as modern people, we really don't like. But there's something to that, something going on in that. And so, and again, I often will say things like, becoming a Christian is not like buying a sensible car. It's much more like falling in love. And when it comes to falling in love, there's 50% of the equation, and you're probably actually responsible for far less than 50% of the equation, because the stuff baked into you has been baked into you completely without your volition as well. But a whole lot of this is on the side of the other. And so I am I know that there is, in some ways, especially in evangelical churches, but also in mainline, there is an existential panic around deconstruction. And I am not saying that to take it less seriously, or to say that this isn't having a profound effect on the health of the church in North America. But I also see these processes of deconstruction as not disconnected from the maturation of people's faiths, especially given the broad sea change we're experiencing at far deeper levels of how we believe and participate and how we see the world. Because, we are individuals going through these things at the same time as a whole society. There are huge spirits. Again, back to the themes of my recent videos, principalities and powers are at work, and we are navigating our own little boats in the midst of a very stormy sea. And so to imagine that, well, it's all just up to me and my little craft is like, that's silly.
Yeah.
Because you might have a wonderful little craft and you go out in a sea and you can cross the Pacific no problem, just because all of the weather patterns were favorable for you. But if you're going to encounter a hurricane or a tsunami or a cyclone, well, maybe the little craft that did just fine in fair weather is not up to the task. And then suddenly we're dealing with far larger dynamics than my ability to construct this little craft. And in such a scenario, people, that's the kinds of things that produce heroes and weathered sailors and people of consequence and substance, because they set out on their 3-hour tour, and now they're going to survive on an island with 6 other strangers for who knows how long. So maybe just missed that Gilligan's Island reference for you, but an older generation would have caught it.
Yeah, probably too young for that. Yeah, but okay, yeah, that that makes a lot of sense, and that's you know one of the things I've been hanging on to through this whole process is that you know because many days it can be easy to think, why couldn't faith just be easier for me? Because sometimes it's like I'm wrestling with these things that other Christians I see around me aren't always wrestling with, and sometimes it can be easy to become cynical about that and just think, why couldn't I just have a faith like that? Why have I been taken on this journey when others haven't been taken on this journey? Um, but to your point right there, I mean, something I've been holding on to is that it's a tumultuous journey to go on, but I'm having faith. I'm having faith that on the other side of this is going to come this kind of deeper, more mature, maybe more robust faith than I've ever even had before.
Right.
Um, which is an encouraging thought because it gives a sense of meaning and purpose to the journey. It's not just that you're kind of floating aimlessly, but that eventually you're going to arrive in a place that is going to make you stronger and more able to withstand storms and the waves of life than maybe ever before. Which I think is kind of the point of that, of the different stages. When you reach that kind of re-enchantment stage, or you reach that stage of maturity in your relationship or something, you're much more stable and much more able to kind of weather the storms as they come. So yes, I'm holding on to hope that will be produced in me, even if I can't quite see it at this point.
Well, and your worldview affords that. Whereas if you fully deconstruct and you basically say, well, all of these experiences that I have in the universe are totally random, and I'm simply
Yeah.
a product of, the problem is, if you actually go there and actually start inhabiting that place really down deep in your core, well, you're going to have one heck of a meaning crisis. And there are some big consequences there. And so for me, I'm even if I'm wrong about God and faith and purpose and all of these things, I will have lived a much more satisfactory life than someone who's totally aware of the truth and that there is no purpose and this is meaningless and all of that. It's like, well, good luck to you, bucko. You know, you're gonna
Yeah.
live like that? I don't think so. But
Yep.
it's just not how we're set to live. And if that is the truth and I am wrong, well, I'm still better off than that guy over there.
Yeah. That's an interesting. I've never quite thought about it that way. That's yep. That's interesting. Um, and I think that ties into, you know, okay, so kind of my initial question. So, you go through this journey and you're aware of the complexity of life and of faith and all, and everything I was talking about before. You know, how, how do you live into the story again? Now that you've kind of stepped back and kind of analyzed it, you kind of have these new cynical glasses, you've looked at it. Okay, you want to live into the story again. Obviously, I know you'll say probably church and participation in the community. Um, but even just kind of in my daily life as I'm making decisions, and you kind of reach these little crossroad moments of like, okay, this is a moment where you could really live as a Christian. And you kind of have that choice before you of how do you live into the story again and commit to those decisions when there's this voice in you that's kind of more cynical and kind of more aware of kind of this whole other world that you weren't aware of before. How can you still, I guess, live into the story? The reason I'm asking that question is because many times I feel like I'll try to do faithful things. I'll say, I want to do X thing because I know it's the right thing. And um, I'll be kind of struck with this feeling of either the doubts or the cynical thoughts, or you'll do this thing and there's kind of almost this imposter syndrome kind of feeling going on of like, you're almost that whole act as if, you're acting as if you're a Christian, but the insides maybe haven't caught up to the actions on the outside. So there's kind of this imposter syndrome going on, and this, am I being inauthentic by doing this because the inside doesn't match what the actions? And oh, I guess what tips would you have for somebody who's trying to live into the story again? Um, Now with this new kind of lens that you're also managing, but still be able to live in the story with conviction.
Well, I think you've nicely laid out the challenge for a lot of people now. I mean, myself included. I mean, part of the reason I was reading C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, 2, 3 times a year was, okay, how what does reenchantment look like? And unlike initial naive enchantment, which sort of came naturally and easily, now I've just got a whole lot more to do to maintain living into this story. And I've got baggage. Now, maybe it's analogous to the difference between the young, energetic person setting out to sea in their small craft and the grizzled veteran who has survived cyclones and tsunamis. That person probably has elbows that don't quite work right, and they've got scars, and they got this arm got mangled in that storm, and it ever since that storm it just never really worked right. And you got that scene in Jaws when they're comparing scars,
Yeah.
and I think that's what it starts to look like, where um and again, back to, let's say, the marriage illustration, where you've got a couple who, it's not the honeymoon period where they both kind of looked into each other's eyes and I'll never do you wrong and you'll never do me wrong. Now it's, boy, you did me wrong, and crap, I did you wrong too. And we've sort of worked that stuff through, but that initial naivete is gone. And so now suddenly when he or she says something and does something and you feel the mistrust well up and you feel the defensiveness wear up and you want to attack or protect or flee, now suddenly it's like, okay, I've done this before. I am going to resist the desire. I'm going to resist the impulse to lash out or flee. I'm going to learn to calm myself down, as I've done in many circumstances. Usually there are some cherished routines and books and places you can go to say, this is how I practice my faith. And I've seen this with people who have been through 12-step programs where, they basically beat the bottle and they're doing okay and everything's fine, but then there's a spouse that dies or there's a crisis in their life, and suddenly that bottle looks good again. And so they haven't been to a meeting in 15 years, but it's back to the meeting, and it's back to, and that's in a lot of ways what I was doing with C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, because I could feel stuff moving. I could feel doubt growing. I could feel foundations getting undercut. And it's like, all right, I need to go back. And then it's okay. Now I'm going to redouble my prayer life. And it's back to the old thing. And you have a sense in life that, you have a sense in life that you can only go back to this so often, but at the same time, there is an end in life when at some point my race will be won. The Apostle Paul talks like that. You run the race to win, but if you've ever, I ran cross country in my freshman year of high school. You long for, you're running that race hard and you see that finish line. It's just, I just want to get on the other end of that finish line, and then I can stop running.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, that's a great picture of it. And I think part of you has to decide internally that whatever the thing is that you're committing to is worth committing to.
Yep.
That's kind of foundational, because when those doubts well up, or in the marriage example, those challenges start to come up, because there's always that option of for the faith thing, I could leave the faith. With the marriage option, it's we could potentially end this marriage. So it's kind of, I think, underneath what you were just saying is there has to be this sense of commitment inside of you that says, this is what I'm gonna fight for, because you're realizing in that new mature stage, you're going to have to start fighting a lot more than you did maybe in the honeymoon stage to try to keep this thing going.
Yep.
And the fighting is going to imply commitment. It's going to imply sacrifice. It's going to imply fighting for it at times when it maybe would be easier to just run away and to not have to engage. So I think that's where I need to get, where I can kind of feel inside where there's still that kind of a fear of commitment going on of like, I'm not sure if I want to go all in yet. I don't know if I want to commit to that point yet. And it's, as Peterson's always talking about the importance of commitment, and where the most, meaning comes from commitment and setting a course towards a goal or an aim. And if you can't set a course or a goal, or a course toward a goal, if every time the opportunity comes to turn back, you're always changing paths. So I think there has to be that kind of commitment, alignment inside of yourself that says, this is what, whether the doubts come, whether the challenges come, this is what I'm going to fight for.
Yep. And that's part of what maturity looks like. In a mature marriage, in a new marriage, it's like, you fell in love, you're excited with everything, and then there's the first fight. It's like, maturity is like, oh, we've had this fight so many times.
Yep.
But we got to have it again, and we have to get through the resolution again. And you just learn these things, and faith is, and someone might say, wow, who needs faith? And it's like, okay, yeah, divorce is out there. But I've seen, and I've seen that side. I've never been divorced, but I know plenty of people have gone that route too. And that option B, and I talk to people 15, 20 years after option B, and I hear, they're going back and forth over that choice and the choices they made then. And I mean, it's that is life in this world.
Yeah.
And as much as we'd like to say, no, I want peaches and cream forever and ever and ongoing youth. That's not what this world affords.
Yep.
And here we are. So what are you going to do with what you got?
Do you think people in my generation, from your perspective, do you think people in my generation struggle more with commitment than in your generation?
Yes, because there's been 2 generations of divorced parents. And so we're looking at grandchildren of divorce, sometimes in both parents. So that's one issue. Another issue is when I was going through in my Christian community, there was and still in society, there was generally a fair amount of, you can call it pressure, you can call it support, whatever you want to, kind of holding people together. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some marriages that should end, or some people that will stay married but shouldn't live together, and all the different permutations that happen with people. But there was something leaning in on couples to give them the motivation that if I walk out of here, there's going to be stigma, there's going to be shame, there's going to be repercussions. And I'll tell you, sometimes when life is hard, walking away from the faith 2 generations ago was a costly business. You would suffer at the hands of your community. Now it's just freedom. Okay. Right. But anybody who, we're the Olympics are, we're in the season of the Olympics. Most of those people are not there because they don't understand commitment.
Right.
If almost all of those people understand commitment at one, there might be a freak or two that just is so outstandingly endowed, but they're all very athletic people. And the one who wins the race is the one who sticks to their diet and sticks to their schedule and listens to their coach and doesn't get injured. So there's the whole, random factors there, because you got to have 2 great athletes and one just gets injured, or the timing of the 4 years. It's just, that's how life is.
Yep. Yep. And I'm actually a guitar player. So I'm always looking at these great guitar players that I love to watch and love to listen to. And I've always got that desire of like, if I just practice more, if I just really double down, I could sound like that, maybe something like them too. But there's kind of that commitment piece of like, they didn't just get there overnight. They didn't just get there. They didn't just pick up a guitar and start playing like that. These legendary players that I love to watch and listen to, they sat down for hours on end, day after day, and practiced and rehearsals and listening to their favorites and kind of finding their own voice. And so I think, the most meaningful things in life require commitment. So, and that's hard, I think, for my generation, for the reasons you were just describing. I think just what we were describing too before in terms of internet and everything that's available to us. So the paradox of choice, I don't know if you've read that book, but I actually haven't read it either, but I've watched some of the YouTube videos of the guy who's the author of it, and just kind of says how having too much choice in life can actually negatively impact people and their decision-making ability, because now more than ever before, we have so many more options available all the time with the internet and smartphones, and we're just talking about all the information available to you and the flexibility that we have, where maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, you were born into a family and the religion of that family was the religion you did, and you learned your father's trade, and there wasn't all of these options of university and pick all these different careers and live in all these different states doing so I think that's part of it, is just we're so blessed in the sense that we have so much opportunity and so much freedom and ability to pursue anything that we want to pursue, which is a great freedom to have. But kind of the dark underside of that is then it becomes much harder to commit to something when you're aware that there's so many of these other great options out there. Part of the reason why, online dating gets critiqued for that too, in terms of when people are kind of in an online dating mode, everyone's so afraid to commit to each other because they have 10 other people lined up right behind you on the app that they're talking to. So at any given time, right. So I think that's part of it too, is that when you're so aware of all the options that are out there for you, it can make it trickier to commit, because when you commit to one thing, you're saying no to, 99 other things. So, finding that thing that you're going to stick to and say, this is the thing I'm going to do, easier said than done, I think. But I also see that struggle amongst my generation too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
So,
see that.
yeah. All right. Well, I do have a couple other questions for you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So they're kind of, honestly, it's kind of all tied together. So we might get on one topic and then it might tie very easily into the other ones. But so this is something I'm interested in, and this is, I guess, what I emailed you about. So kind of this idea of, Christianity, understanding who ultimately gets to participate in the age to come. Obviously, a very debated topic amongst many Christians, and a lot of very strong opinions on that. And I've always kind of, in my more so conservative Baptists, kind of with the Reformed bent, much more traditional and kind of much more conservative in terms of, who gets to participate in the age to come, and I'm kind of getting out there now and kind of realizing there's more perspectives out there and trying to wrestle through it and say, what's right here, and how should I think through this topic? I think I laid this out in the email, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's kind of like, there's these three buckets. There's kind of like the exclusivist bucket, inclusivist bucket, and then there's universalist bucket. So exclusivist being, the only people that get to go to heaven or to participate in the age to come are the ones who explicitly trust in Christ in this life and pray the prayer and, accept him into to their life. There's no exceptions to that. Inclusivism, which is something I've been more interested in, is more so like, there's potential for a provision out there that maybe there is some way that God could work through situations where there's the kind of the classic examples of, what about people who never get to hear the gospel, or what about babies that die when they're really young, and kind of examples like that. And then universalism. So I guess I would love to get your insight on it. I mean, I always grew up with a strong kind of exclusivist kind of background of like, it's cut and dry. This is what the text says, very much kind of, we don't want to deviate too much from what the text says. But I always kind of had those questions about, well, what about this example? Or what about, a person maybe born with disabilities, or a person who dies in, before, age 2 or something, and like, how does that all work out? And I was floored the first time I read Mere Christianity, because in Mere Christianity, Lewis kind of portrays that question and says, well, I used to think before I was a Christian, isn't that unfair that people who don't get to hear about Christ don't get to participate in the age to come? And then he kind of gives essentially kind of like, he pleads to almost a sort of mystery of, we don't really know for sure how he will deal with people who don't hear the gospel, or who don't hear, about him in this life. And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, in the circles that I grew up in, that would have been a big no-no. That would have been nope, you're crossing a very dangerous line there. So it was interesting to me hearing Lewis kind of portray that example. I think in the end of one of the Narnia books with Emeth, there's kind of that classic example too, of where he says, you worship a different God from our God, but I'm gonna grant your worship of this other God as worship to me, and then now you can come into my kingdom with me. And I know Lewis has gotten a lot of flack for that too. So anyway, so this has been it's been an important topic for me, because I've always kind of had a lot of questions about it, and it factors into my, I think, perspective of God and fairness. What is fair, what's not fair. There's just a lot baked into it, and I'm trying to kind of explore what's out there and see. And more than ever before, I think I'm open to other perspectives on it. But there's a lot of that kind of, I hate to use the term fundamentalism because it's just, I think, probably overused, but there's a lot of that kind of bit baked into me, where if you go to a Piper church and you even suggest that that would be an option, you know, you would absolutely get shut down and say, no, that's a big no-no. Even in the Gospel Coalition articles, you know, where they talk about C.S. Lewis, they always, periodically they'll post these articles and say, here are 7 things you need to be wary of with C.S. Lewis. And that's usually 1 or 2 on the list of, you know, here's a dangerous idea that he has that we want to stay away from. So I'm curious, you know, just give me, if you feel comfortable sharing, just your honest thoughts on Lewis and that topic, and, you know, how does that fit into Christianity? How much space do you think is out there, you know, to be able to realistically flex between one of those views? That's a loaded question, I know. So
I'm very reluctant to share my opinions on the internet. I don't know where you got the idea that I'd talk about something like this.
I figured that'd be a struggle for you.
Well, I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask a question about what we're asking about, because to one degree or another, we're asking about policy. Say, okay, well, what's the policy of heaven? What's the minimum entrance requirement by which I can somehow qualify for participation in the life to come in a way that I want? Okay. And there's lots of other interesting assumptions beneath it, such as, okay, heaven is sort of like Santa Barbara and hell is sort of like the bad areas of Stockton. You know, we have all these, and so when I talk to people, there's all these things kind of floating around in them, and they usually rush to this question and ask this question. And what I usually do is I usually back them off and I say, now, wait a minute. So what you're asking me, a Calvinist, is about the qualifications by which you can somehow qualify for entrance into, and, you know, right away, you're already anticipating some of what I'm going to say, to the degree that, you know, this should be a question that Calvinists don't worry too much about, because the answer is easy. Everyone God wants. Now, that answer pulls in some other things that people begin to wonder about, but I can similarly sort of deconstruct some of those questions too. Dallas Willard had another approach to this, which was, who gets to go to heaven? Anyone who can stand it, which sort of flips it on its head, because, well, if you have any understanding of the banquet of the Lamb, the celebration of the banquet of the Lamb is all about Jesus. And from everything that Richard Dawkins says, he doesn't want to have anything to do with Jesus. So it would seem torture to force him into that party, wouldn't it? So there's another strange twist on it. So in other words, part of usually the first task in addressing this setup is, let's take a look at the setup that you've addressed and trying to force me into an answer into this setup, because there are issues with this setup as it is that are being concealed and trying to force people. So what is the policy of the pearly gate? St. Peter has a stick, and everyone or a scale, and everybody who's, you know, soul outweighs or doesn't weigh this. I mean, people have been playing this game since the Book of the Dead and the Egyptians. So let's right away recognize that whole business and say, let's have a little bit of skepticism about that game, because whereas you can certainly read particular New Testament texts in the light of that, there are many other texts that suggest all sorts of other things going on as well. So let's back off the 3 buckets, as it were, right from the start. Now, universalism is sort of a way of not worrying about the other 2 buckets, because you say everybody gets there. Okay. There's some undesirable aspects to that, which sort of means that, let's say, Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, the life that they lived in this world really didn't matter, because they're both finally going into the big U bucket. And then, of course, at that point, then universalists begin to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not exactly what we're saying. Okay, well, then exactly what are we talking about in all of this here? Because
Yeah.
on one hand, we very much want our lives and decisions in this world to be consequential for the next. And there's absolutely nothing in the Bible that would deter us from that thought, that what we say and what we do and the choices we make in this dispensation are in fact consequential for the next. So let's take that and say, okay, let's include that picture, because that picture actually seems healthy for human beings and human society, that it is, generally speaking, a healthy thing to concern ourselves with the next world in terms of the choices we make in this world. Now, you can be overly concerned or neurotic, or there can be all kinds of bad ways of doing that. But to
Yeah.
eliminate the concern completely also seems like a bad idea. And so the
Mhm.
Bible does not say, don't worry about how you live now. God just is like, well, you killed all those people and you tortured and maimed and murdered, but that doesn't really matter, does it? God seems very invested in how we live in this world. And the Egyptians had an idea about that, and the Hebrews had some really strong ideas about that. So let's just take that. And now let's also, which is not uncontested in our realm, say, well, is there another dispensation? And say, well, okay, there's A or B, there is or there isn't. Okay, so let's suppose there isn't another dispensation. And Dawkins is right, where, okay, dead is dead. Boom. Well, suddenly we're sort of back in Hitler, Mother Teresa land. And so you've just now undercut the conceptualization that what we do in this life is significant for a next dispensation. So if we can agree to hold on to that, we've actually already accomplished something. Let's take the exclusivist bucket and do a little policy chart for that. So if you believe in your heart and confess with your lips, then you make it into the exclusivistic bucket. But very quickly, the exclusivists begin to add new qualifiers to that, because they've also read the portions that note that Jesus says things like, well, you know, some people are pretty sure they made the E bucket and they didn't. So then
Yeah.
suddenly it's like, oh, okay. So believe with your heart and confess with your lips and really, really mean it. But now suddenly all the neurotics are like,
Yeah.
am I really, really
That's
meaning
me.
it? That's right.
That's me.
Am I doing it? And then Jesus, then you've got Matthew 25 and you got the sheep and the goats. And so
Mhm.
then you've got all kinds of other people that are like, well, that whole belief in your heart, that's not really matters. What really matters is what you do for the least of these, because we've got Matthew 25. So now suddenly we've got lots of different subsections of the E bucket. And so what I'm with all of this, what I'm saying is this is an important conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. There's a reason we've had debates, vigorous debates about this conversation. It's quite likely that Paul Vanderklay in a video will not give such an answer that the conversation will be exercised from humanity from this day forward. That will likely not happen. And so probably what we should do is sort of like Lewis, take a step back and say, let's just talk about some of these things, shall we? And the Calvinist can kind of say who is included in the banquet of the Lamb? Everyone God wants at the table. Now, suddenly, if I put it in that realm, all sorts of parables sort of light up, parables that we weren't paying any attention to when we looked at our three buckets, because, well, he sends out the invitations and all kinds of people are like, I don't know if I want to go. I'm a little busy today. And the food at those banquets, I don't know if it's, and so, well, what about your Calvinism then, and divine election and
Yeah.
decrees and all those
Yeah.
things? And so
Yeah.
it's a big conversation.
It is.
And as a pastor, what I usually do is sort of cut to a chase with people and say, well, what do you want? And we'll say, well, I don't want to go to hell. Well, that's reasonable. All the eternal conscious torment. I mean, this is a phrase I've just heard in the last few years, and it's like, oh, well, everyone arguing for universalism just turned the heat up on all the neurotics, because it used to be that hell was bad enough. Now you've just turned the resolution up and they're thinking eternal conscious torment. Oh my goodness. It's like, yeah, big favor, universalists. You try to say, no, don't worry about eternal conscious torment. That's a bad idea. But everyone who's high in neuroticism is
Yeah.
now worrying about it. Great move, people.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so,
Yes.
so, and so then I'll say, okay, well, do you want to be with Jesus? And I'm not so sure. Well, tell me about that not sureness. Well, I'm worried about dead Canaanites, and I'm worried about goats, and I'm worried about, okay, well, let's begin with the premise that you're little and God's big, that you're dim and God's bright, that you're sort of generous towards other people, but God is way more generous towards other people. For example, he sends the rain and the sunshine to fall on the just and the unjust, and Jesus calls that perfection. And Jesus says, although you are evil, to give your child an egg and not a scorpion. God, who is a lot better than you, but God is also more demanding than you. So in other words, what I usually do is say, let's not worry about the policy of heaven, because number one, God hasn't asked you to set it, because number two, you wouldn't do a good job. So let's just imagine that the master of the universe will get this right. And if you say, I don't trust him to get it right, I think you've just brought onto yourself way more problems, because if he didn't get that right, what else didn't he get right? In other words, sort of built into Christian theism of God's generosity, God's justice, God's goodness is the answer that whatever he does with us in terms of participation in a coming dispensation will be more just than we can imagine and more merciful than we can imagine. So, because when people come with this question is, do you just want the policy, or do you want to judge the policy? And by judging the policy, will you judge the maker of the policy? So I'm going to jump to the chase and say, if you decide you want to judge God, go right ahead, but be careful with that posture, because implicitly what you're saying is you could do a better job. And I don't know about everyone who knows you really well, but chances are everyone around you thinks maybe not. And because now we've got self-serving bias here, because I think I could do a better job than God. And it's actually really remarkable in a show like The Good Place, where at the end of it, when finally these four randos get to step in fresh. Talk about what is it? A Mary Sue story. These four randos get to decide the policy about afterlifeness in this universe. Oh, good. We're giving this to four random people when we have a fair amount of trembling about a jury by 12 members of our peers. We're going to give the whole thing to four randos, and they're just on the top of it going to do a better job than the Almighty, who actually designed all of this. So, as a pastor, what I usually do is say, what you really have to do is trust God. And then someone would say, but how do I know? And then I'll say, well, what kind of God would put his son not only in harm's way, but to be tortured and died? And some people say, well, that's obviously not a very good father. Well, but the son was in on it. And in other words, the trust thing is finally answered by Jesus. And so I'll just usually back people off from saying, it's legitimate to have a conversation about the afterlife. The church has been discussing this for a couple thousand years, but have that conversation over here. But when it comes to your heart, learn to trust him.
Sure.
because not trusting him not only won't help your heart, it isn't terribly rational. And if God can't be trusted with this kind of thing, I don't know what chance you think you might have in beating such a system. Because
Hmm.
for what we know, you know, after we shuffle off this mortal coil, we don't know.
Yeah.
So the answer, as with many Christian answers, is learn to trust,
Hmm.
because that will actually resolve a whole bunch of things.
Oh, yeah. That's hard. That's hard to do. Clearly.
Well, the whole story of the Bible is our trust issues. The serpent
Yeah.
comes along and says, that tree over there, are you sure God's not holding out on you? I mean, that's the first question.
Yep. So, okay. So I think kind of where it sounds like there's almost kind of like this plea. You're somewhat of a, okay. So there's kind of, whatever conclusion you come to on this topic where you think, this is what I think scripture teaches or whatever, and then saying, okay, how do I want to say this? Is it a trusting God with the mystery of it and saying, well, we don't really know for sure what's going to happen, so we'll kind of leave it to mystery and trust in God's nature that he's going to do what's right? Or is it like we just need to, we just need to swallow the bitter pill of how hard this teaching is, and then say, we just need to trust God that what he's doing is right. He's told us what he's going to do. Does that make sense? Because I think maybe from some people who are from the more rigid camp will say, opening it up even to mystery and saying we don't know what he will do, they could claim that could almost be, in a sense, a sort of unbelief, because you're going against the clear teaching of scripture, and this is what scripture says will happen, and this is who's in and who's not. And if you're even leave that door open, you're in a sense not trusting God, because you're saying, what's in the text, there's got to be, maybe there's more to the story, I guess. Does that make sense? I
Yeah.
guess okay, so it's like is it a trust in the mystery of it, or is it a trust in this is the conclusion that we think this is how it's going to work? I don't know if I'm articulating
It's a
myself.
trust in the character of God, because when push comes to shove, you don't have much else. Think about this. Let's imagine that, suddenly we all opened our Bibles tomorrow and there's a new verse in it says, God damns all the English speakers and English thinkers. Uh-oh. Well, crap. Now I got to learn a new language, and I got to do work. I got to start thinking in a new language. Well, that arbitrary God just damned all the English speakers and all the English thinkers even. So not only do I not have to let English leave my lips, I have to not let English inhabit my brain. And I was born speaking this language, and I'm in my 50s and the cake is baked. And how am I going to stop thinking English, for Pete's sake, in order to save my immortal soul? Well, let's imagine God. We have such a God who does this kind of thing. What's your plan? Because tomorrow he might say, yeah, we're going to take out the Germans too. I mean, in that case, you're gonna do what? Build a tower in order to get up and see God eye to eye? No, we know a tower's not going to work. You're going to send up a spaceship. I mean, what odds do you have? And so it's either trust or don't trust. And for all of us humans, it's like, I'll try. And then here's an even nastier little bit. As we started, I'm low in neuroticism. You know what that makes? And I had, my parents stayed together, my grandparents stayed together, my parents were not corrupt in the church at all. They really believed this stuff. They were wonderful to me. They were supportive. I mean, I have had a wonderful life. in many respects, about one of the best this planet has to give, you know. And so, and I'm low in neuroticism. And so trusting is easy for me. You're higher in neuroticism, you know. Sorry about that. Now there are circumstances in which you're better off being higher in neuroticism. You know, maybe if all of us low in neuroticism, some wave comes through humanity and history, and all of us trusting, happy folks get wiped out, and all you worriers, you know, you all survived the pandemic or what have you, and now, you know, you're out there multiplying, and now you're multiplying lots of worrying children, but 10 or 15 generations, more and more of us non-worry folks begin to, I mean, you can run this stuff forever in your brain.
Yep.
And so again, as a pastor, someone comes in and wants to talk to me, and I got to take this whole thing and I got to get it right down to a nub. And so what I'm going to tell them is learn to trust God. Well, what about God's damnation of English speakers? Well, if God is arbitrarily damning English speakers, sorry, we're both cooked, and there's not a darn thing we can do. And if God wants to whisk me out of this world and put me in eternal conscious torment, there's probably not a lot I can do. But if that's the administration of the universe and I don't like it, I can shake my fist at the heavens. But, you know, in the Dominican Republic, rats would get into the house, and I had a live trap, and I would catch them and I would put them in the water, and they'd look up at me with their little eyes like, are you really going to drown me? Yep, I am. I'm going to drown you, because if I just think, oh, I would have saved the little rat, I'm going to go 100 feet from the house and let the little fella go. I know exactly where he's going to be, back in my kitchen, eating the food for my children. Now, how does God administer the universe? Well, I'm looking for clues, and I'm a Christian, so I'm looking at the Bible. There's some Muslims out there saying, well, yeah, you Christians, you're better than these other people. And Paul Vanderklay, you don't drink alcohol, you don't do Ramadan, and you don't, and you don't do the Hajj, and, you're reading, you think Christians rose from the dead. Well, maybe Allah will be good to you. And say, all right, well, I'm not in control of you. I got me to steward, and that's plenty for me. And so this is the basket I'm putting my eggs in. And the only way those eggs settled is I learn to trust. And could I be wrong? I'm probably wrong about more than I'm right. But at some point, you make your decision, you pick your road, you go down it. And doesn't mean other things don't happen, but what are you going to do? What else are you going to do? Sit there at the crossroads and say, I'm not going to go down any road. Great. You're going to live in a fork? That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. And it built into this too is kind of, I think the fear of the cost of being wrong, especially on a topic like this. So, and this kind of comes, this is why it ties into hell and other things like that. But it's, there's so much weight in my mind, at least when I think about it, of like, okay, we've got to get, if there's anything we got to get right, it's that. I'm thinking to myself, because, this then impacts, this will greatly impact the way you live your life. And that's, and I'm not even in terms of myself, but in terms of evangelism, like sharing your faith with people, people from kind of more of that exclusivist perspective will critique inclusivist or universalist types and say, well, problem, because it kills the evangelical, the spirit for evangelism. Because if you think people are going to eventually all end up there, then why would you go out of your way to try to share your faith with people? So baked, and you can probably see this in me, baked in is this very strong kind of evangelical, participated in Campus Crusade in college, and there's very much this mindset of the Christian life is to go out and share your faith with people and try to get as many people saved as possible. So when you approach this question, the way you answer that question is going to greatly impact, the actions that you'll take. If I go down the universalism path, my approaches toward evangelism and how I share my faith are probably going to be different than if I held to kind of that exclusivist path. So I think I'm trying to figure this out because it's like, it's going to impact the way that I interact with my faith with other people and the level of urgency with which I feel like I need to share my faith with people. And then just kind of the weight of being wrong about it. So even just the topic of hell. So it's, and this is one of the reasons why hell is kind of a hard topic, because it kind of escalates the stakes really highly for a lot of these conversations. So, if you end up being universalist and think everybody ends up there, so you spend your life, you're not really that, it's not as important to you to share your faith with people because you're thinking, everyone will end up there. I'm sure Luke Thompson and others probably have a lot of critiques of that. But I'm just kind of saying hypothetically, and then you get to the end one day and you realize, well, no, you were wrong on that, because hell's a real place and people really do go there forever. And you made all these decisions on the assumption that it wasn't, that it didn't exist, or that it was a temporary place or whatever. So I think there's just kind of this, and I think that sort of fuels the fundamentalism. I think somewhat fuels that impulse, because there's this fear of being wrong that tells you I need to accept the lowest common denominator. I need to accept the harshest possible thing, because I would rather accept something too harsh and then realize that, it was better than it was, maybe not as harsh as I thought, versus maybe be something not quite so harsh. And then you realize, I was actually wrong. I don't know if that makes sense, but I've kind of seen that fundamentalist kind of impulse where it's, we need to stick as close to the text as possible. We need to be as conservative as possible. If there's a harsh interpretation and there's kind of a softer interpretation, we've got to take the harsh one.
Hedge the Torah.
Yep, exactly. So I think there's some of that baked into me too, of, it's such a high pressure thing, because it's like, well, I've got to get this right, because the way you answer this question is going to impact your actions and the attitudes you have about faith. So I hope that makes sense why, for me, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about and trying to wrestle through. There's a lot of that kind of evangelical mindset inside of me, which is, the Christian faith is about sharing your faith with other people and trying to get as many people saved as you possibly can, which that's very evangelical language, as you know.
Let me say a few things. Number one, in Sacramento, there are a fair number of street preachers, or there's a few of them that come by here on Florin Road. So my church is on a main strip. And every now and then the street preacher will come. They'll have a big sign, they'll have a blowhorn. I look at him, I say, God bless him. Just go out there, and I don't have any problem with what he's doing. Sometimes I'll stop and chat with them because and I find out they're actually from other cities and they come here. And so I find that interesting. And I've known people that are just really good with street evangelism, and God bless them. I've got no argument with them in terms of, I believe they're doing the work of the Lord. And I myself, people in my church understand what I'm doing as, I see my channel as an evangelistic project. Well, so let me say that. Now, let me make a couple other observations. Number one, when I first went away to college, so Christian Reformed Church was sort of a version of that. Now, of course, my father was my father, and he was a big Lewis fan. And, but I went to, when I first started reading the Bible for myself. And what I mean by that is I'm far enough away from home. I've got a certain sense of my own autonomy, my own independence. And I want to, everybody'd been reading the Bible for me. I want to, sort of this way that sparks all sorts of heresies. I'm going to read the Bible for myself. I want to see what it says. And I came with it with this filter, this very for spiritual law, street evangelism, win souls for Christ filter. And I thought, I want to read the New Testament. I don't want to see, I'll even lay aside the Old Testament. Okay. Because, Jesus hasn't died yet or come yet and all that stuff. So I'm just going to read the New Testament. In fact, I'm just going to read Jesus. And I want to circle every time in the Bible when Jesus says, unless you have a personal relationship with me, or you have the four spirits, and it's like, I don't find any of these things in here. And I find Jesus talking about dietary laws and, tithing, fasting. I find Jesus, all this, and you'd think if this was the one thing of supreme importance, I could read the Gospels and not only find it, but not be able to miss it. And so, and that then sets up a much deeper question, which I still continue to struggle with, which is, well, it's very clear that in the gospel, Jesus is trying to secure everything. And now what language can I have to actually get this in? And so then I look to the Bible itself, and it seems to me other types of language, a lot of which you'll hear me use now, like the reconciliation of heaven and earth, that is sort of a better frame to kind of understand everything Jesus has to say. Otherwise, it's all blah, 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 believe in me, blah, 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 blah. And then all the other stuff that makes up most of the New Testament is sort of chaff, and you can get rid of that, and you can put it on a little sign and on a card and give it to people. And if you do this, but then we're back to the 3 buckets. And then we're back to all of those games. So I had to say, okay, now I'm a Christian, so I believe Jesus is the Son of God, and I believe Jesus came to reveal not only through his words, but through his life and through his death and his resurrection and ascension, promise of the second coming. I am a small, old Orthodox Christian. I am a crunchy Christian who believes in miracles and all of these things. But I hear Jesus spending all of this time talking about, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. Be on the guard for all kinds of greed. Well, wait a minute. As long as I get this believe with Jesus right, then I don't have to worry about greed, right? And that's what they say at the front end of the crusade. But after you actually go forward and, bend your knee and pray the sinner's prayer, now suddenly I have to worry about greed. And you say, now, and I've worked both ends of this whole thing. And so then people are like, hey, wait a minute. There's a bait and switch happened here, because you said all I had to do was believe in Jesus and I get to go to heaven when I die. You didn't say I had to stop doing drugs or cheating on my wife or somehow devote most of my income to the welfare of my children. And now you say I do. And the church Christians are kind of like, well, that's what it means to be a Christian. It's like, no. I listened very carefully to the speech that Billy Graham gave. Mm-hmm. And I didn't hear any of this stuff. And so in other words, now suddenly you have to connect taking care of your children and not cheating on your wife and not going to sleep every night soused with alcohol, suddenly connected with this believing in Jesus. How do these things hold together? And so very quickly we're back into, well, what on earth is this whole thing about? Because you just reduced it all the way down to this feeling of intention at one particular point and saying these words. And I'm a little skeptical. And I'm not skeptical because I've had some grand revelation. I'm skeptical because I'm watching all of you, and you're good to your children and you're not cheating on your wife. And well, how does that fit into a whole picture? Mm-hmm. So I am not a universalist. And I do not want to. And if you listen to Lewis can be downright terrifying in some points when he talks about, the threat of hell. I mean, even though he's sort of in this inclusivist basket, there are a few people that are actually scarier than Lewis when he says, every decision you make is that little turn.
Yep.
And it's like, whoa, I thought I could just go down at the crusade and get the ticket stamped and continue as normal, because now I got, and evangelicals regularly deconstruct that view. Mm-hmm. And so at some point I look at them and say, now y'all got to do some work on this, because you're sort of cheating people and they're figuring it out, and it's not a good look. So let's work on our language and try and look for language that helps. And then suddenly you begin to look at the history of the church and realize, we've all been working on this for quite a while. And in many ways, faith is a gift and the Christian life is mysterious. And Judas, ends badly and Peter gets redeemed and So yeah, there's plenty of mysteries in there, but there's lots of stuff that isn't terribly mysterious, which
Mhm.
is, you know, fishing after the resurrection and fish on a fire and Peter, feed my sheep. Well, what about John? Don't worry about him. You follow me. Let John worry about John. You worry about you. And so that's part of the reason why, on one hand, should you, is hell, should you worry about eternally being divorced from the goodness and glory and pleasure of God? Absolutely. And I am not going to deconstruct people who go out there on the street, because I have talked to plenty of wonderful Christians who them or their parents came to faith because someone brought a message on a trite little card with 4 spiritual laws, and they changed their life, and their entire family was better off for it. So I am not going to complain or deconstruct those folks in the least. And so I do believe in evangelism, and I believe my channel is a work of evangelism. And those, well, what exactly is your evangelism? I don't know. Why don't you watch a few hundred hours of me? And I don't know if I can distill it all into one little thing, but I think you're seeing it. Well, I don't think you're doing it right. Okay, you do it better. Be my guest.
Yeah.
I'd love you to do it better. I would, at the end of this life, I do believe I will stand before my Lord and be called to give an account. And there will be some things that I don't want him to see, and I don't want him to show me, and I don't want to answer for. And how exactly we all deal with that, I'm going to have to leave to him. And I think about that, but a lot of these people offer these little easy, trite answers. And I just think, well, I've seen a lot of your answer and I'm not impressed. And so I'm going to keep trusting and praying and studying and thinking and trying to do the best I can in my own little way. And if it's a big mess, well, I mean, very early on, I remember did a conversation with someone who wasn't a Christian, and I was getting emails from this woman, and she's like, you talked to this person and you didn't present the gospel to them. And I was thinking, okay, you go round him up and do your deal. And if he says, I'm going to church next week, and he starts a Christian life that goes from here to eternity, I will praise you and your way of doing it night and day. But I'm working with what I've seen and what I've got. And so I don't know what else I can do.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So, I don't know where to begin with that. So, okay. So for you, when you see the street preacher, he's he's on the street corner, he's preaching at people, you know, when you see that person doing that, um, where are you getting the mindset to yourself to think, that's not, are you seeing that person and thinking to yourself, that's not the most effective way to go about this? Like, I admire what you're doing, but I don't think you're doing it in an effective way. Or what, when you see, or are you kind of saying, what you were just saying, they're not giving a holistic enough picture? Or what? I'm trying to figure out your kind of perspective on evangelism, because I see what you're doing. I do see it as evangelism, because I've been watching your channel for a long time. But clearly what you're doing is very different than the street preacher, or very different than the campus crusade, college students going around with the KGP booklet with the 4 spiritual laws, sharing with people just on a whim, So I'm trying to figure out your mindset, and kind of, and how you've gotten to the place that you're at. I mean, I think you partially just answered that, but what when you see people kind of engaging in, let's say, the street evangelism, what's going through your head about their process and what they're doing? And does that make sense, that
Oh,
question?
sure. Oh, lots of things, actually. One thing is, gosh, they've got a certain amount of zeal that I wish I had. 2, I know a lot of people who have deconstructed, people who have never given Christianity a thought, people who are of other religions, and they're driving by this guy thinking he's a nut. Well, why do I think they think that? Because they told me. And they have like zero respect for him. I also know that somebody's going to drive down that street, see that sign, and God's going to use it, and they're going to be okay. If you look at some of the old Freddie and Paul shows, one of the guys on the show is the Jesus man, and that's my friend Phil. And my friend Phil, after he died, not after he died, after his wife died, he just, the other day, he told me his story in a nutshell. He said, you know, when I was a young man, I lived for me. And when I married my wife and had kids, I lived for my family. And when my kids grew up and my wife died, I decided I'm going to live for Jesus. And so what Phil does is he has this, gosh, I've got a few of them around here. It's just, I don't want to get up and grab one, but he has this little sort of inverted letter sign that says Jesus. That's all it says. And it's the reverse letters. So a lot of times people have never seen the sign, and, you know, it's kind of like an optical illusion. He says, what does this say? And they look at it and they can't figure it out because it's all these strange lines. And then suddenly, bang, the brain flips, it reverses that, it's Jesus. And all he does is he paints this inverted letter sign. He'll cut it into grass. He'll make signs. He'll put it on his motorhome. He's got all these little cards and stickers and magnets. They're all over my church. He puts them in hospitals. And I got my book up there as he gives them around. Well, I got to show you the book because this is just too much
Okay,
fun.
let's see it. Let's see it.
So I actually have two books from him. And, you know, this is 2008 to 2020, and this is 2008 to 2016. And he's got, you know, there he is with the signs, and here he gives them to people. And, you know, and every time he makes a new book, I say, oh, Phil, I want another copy of your book. I'll pay for it. I don't care. I don't care what it costs. I just, you know, 30, 40 bucks or something for this book.
Oh my goodness.
And, you know, and then he's got stories of, you know, he gave someone the Jesus sign and, you know, they became a Christian and then they died. And, you know, that there's no pure story for that kind of Christianity. And so this is Phil's mission. And gosh, you know, when his wife died, I first got to know Phil because I got to know his son, because his son grew up in this church and was kind of an Anabaptist church. And he calls me, his son years ago, calls me, phoned off the blue. Hi, are you a Reformed pastor? Yeah. Can you mentor me? Okay. And at that point I had no YouTube following. So gosh, someone wants to listen to me. How unusual. And I said, well, why do you want a Reformed pastor? Well, I became Reformed on the internet. Okay. And so then, and then I got to know him, and then I got to know his father. And then, you know, Phil's wife died, and I went to her funeral over at the church there. And, you know, Ingy was, from listening to the funeral, just a beloved saint who, she cleaned houses for a living. And when anybody had a baby or there's a death in the family, she'd be there with a casserole, and do you need me to clean your house? And she'd clean their house for them. And there's a young mother struggling, she'd come and clean her house. I mean, this is what she did. And then when she died, you know, you could just tell the stories at the funeral about the community were, you know, Ingy was a saint, and Philip, when his wife died, was, you know, it was grief stricken. What am I going to do without my wife? You know what he's going to do? He's going to make Jesus signs. He's going to litter the world with them. And, you know, I know people's lives are complex, but you know what? Doggone it. If he doesn't have stories that I believe are 100% true, that he showed up someone and gave someone this silly Jesus sign, it's not silly at all, and they were blessed by it, I just say, Phil, the Jesus man, kind of looks like Santa Claus. You go to town. And so, you know, he's on the Freddie and Paul show sometimes. And I think someday he's going to stand before his Lord, and his Lord's going to say, Phil, well done, good and faithful servant. You know, you took what you had and you did for me. And, you know, what are we gonna, what, you know, who am I to tell this man to stop?
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful. And same with the sign guy. And I know full well, part of people are like, he shouldn't do that. He's giving Christianity a bad name. And it's like, if someone is so bothered that this dude will come from Vacaville and hold up a sign on a corner when there's all sorts of signs on the corners for dispensaries and you know, ambulance chasing lawyers, and you know, this dude with a Jesus sign is somehow harming the universe. Give me a break. So that's how I feel. That's what goes through my head. So on one hand, you know, I I really respect Phil and his sincerity and his commitment. And so I'm not going to say a word against him. Do I know that for a lot of people, just getting a little inverted lettered sign isn't going to deal with all of the things that they have in their head and in their heart? Well, yeah, well, that's kind of where I come in. And so I deal with them and some of that stuff. And you know, some of the most gratifying emails I get from people are ones that say, Paul, I was ready to chuck the whole thing, and I listened to your insane meanderings hours on end, and I don't know why, but somehow it helps. And I think, hey, there you go. I've done my thing.
There you go.
You know, Phil's just a lot more efficient. He just has to hand off the sign. I spend hours yakking to people. So, but God and his economy, I say there's room for us both.
So, okay, that was a great story. So there's kind of this, it sounds like for you, there's not like a right way to do it. It's what you're saying. You're saying that
I think I'm doing it the right way, but
I'm saying, because some people will say, well, what your friend who's on the street corner, that's the right way, or that what you're doing is the right way. And it's, so you have kind of, it seems like more of a, I'd say, open perspective on it. I'm just like, there's kind of different ways of going about it. Some people need that, just kind of quick little 4 spiritual laws. That's all they need. Some people, you have to sit with them for years. And I mean, I think about Lewis's conversion. I mean, it took him years, even just to move from atheism to theism, and then from theism to believe in Christianity. That wasn't a quick, somebody just shared the 4 spiritual laws with him, and then he just kind of was from 0 to 60, or did a whole 180. It's, it took years of working through his doubts and things that he was struggling with, and the friendships there. And so I agree with you. I think that's maybe that was part of my frustration with many ways that I've seen evangelism work out in the church. Of sometimes, there is so much emphasis on just, well, we got to get them to pray the prayer, and we just need to get them the spiritual laws, and that, the other stuff doesn't really matter as much. And I think when I saw it, at least in campus ministry, doing that sort of thing, when somebody would, you'd get them to pray the prayer, but then there's kind of that question in the back of your mind. I mean, 2 weeks from now, or a month from now, or 2 months from now, are they even going to remember that conversation? But you kind of walk away and think, well, this person's a Christian now, and I kind of did my job. And it's like, and that's where I agree with you. When you look at Jesus and the life that he lived and the things that he talked about, he talked a lot more about all the things that you were saying, than about, okay, now you just need to go out and you need to get people to pray this prayer and trust in these 4 points, so that so that they can be entered into the kingdom. So yeah, it's what I'm getting from you is it's more so this holistic approach. I think
that's how I am. But I know plenty of people who are just, and you listen to their story and say, they told me this story, and I thought, they're right, I'll be a Christian. And they were a good Christian for the rest of their life. You meet them too. Yep. So I leave God in charge of the world, and I say, I got my own messes in me that why am I gonna wade into your life and think I can clean you up when I can't clean me up? And well, doesn't Jesus say that with the speck and the log? So again, so what do I tell people? Oh, why don't you start with Jesus and read the kind of things he has to say and go there. It doesn't seem like a bad place to start. To be a Christian, well, I'll start with Jesus. Oh, good. That's good. Start there.
Yep. Yeah. So that's good. So I don't know how much time we have left. I know we're kind of coming up on.
We should land the plane. We've done this for 2 hours.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, it's great. It's great talking with you, Paul. Thanks for entertaining some of my ideas and some of my questions.
Okay, Michael. It's good to talk to you.
Yep. All right. Take it easy. Have a good one.
Send me the link to just make it easier on me to your conversation with Cassidy so I can put that in the notes too.
Okay. Okay. I will. All right,
Michael. Take care.
Have a good one.
Yep. Bye-bye.